Iran was supposed to blink first. That was the theory. Bomb it, blockade it, threaten it. Then wait for Tehran to panic and sign whatever Washington puts on the table. Small problem. Iran seems to have read the table more carefully than Washington did, because right now, the country under pressure may have the stronger hand. If you find this useful, like and subscribe. Here's where we are. The United States has been trying to force Iran into accepting a new nuclear arrangement after the military strikes that began on the 28th of February. The maximal American demands appear to have narrowed. The old shopping list, ballistic missiles, regional allies, domestic political changes inside Iran seems to have been quietly put back on the shelf. That leaves one central issue: uranium enrichment. Iran has signaled before that it could accept a temporary pause in enrichment. But the number matters. Tehran floated something like 5 years. Washington, according to the proposals now being discussed, appears to want something much longer, perhaps 10, 12, 15, even 20 years. That's not a pause. That's a political lifetime. Then comes the stockpile issue. Some American officials reportedly want Iran to hand over its enriched uranium, possibly to the United States itself. I don't know who thought that was a serious proposal, but I hope they didn't spend long on it. Iran handing its nuclear material to the country that just attacked it is not diplomacy. It's wishful thinking in a suit. Iran rejected the terms quickly. Its parliament speaker and foreign ministry called the proposals unacceptable. And now Donald Trump is back to threatening more strikes. But this time, something important has changed. America's Gulf allies are not cheering him on. The first big story here is not Iran's defiance. That was predictable. The real story is Saudi Arabia saying no. Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's crown prince and de facto ruler, has warned Trump against further escalation. That matters enormously, because Saudi Arabia is not some distant commentator writing an op-ed from a comfortable office. Saudi Arabia sits inside the blast radius of this crisis. If the United States escalates against Iran again, the Gulf pays first. Saudi oil exports are vulnerable. Gulf shipping is vulnerable. Qatar's natural gas exports are vulnerable. Kuwait's energy routes are vulnerable. And if the Houthis enter the conflict more aggressively, the Red Sea becomes another pressure point. That would hit Saudi Arabia hard, because the Red Sea is one of its remaining export routes when the Strait of Hormuz becomes unusable. So when Riyadh reportedly tells Washington it cannot use Saudi bases, Saudi facilities, or Saudi airspace for a further escalation, that is not a small diplomatic irritation. That is a strategic warning. In plain terms, the people living next to the fire are telling Washington to stop playing with matches. Qatar and Kuwait appear to have followed the same line. The UAE may be an exception, but the broader Gulf mood seems to have shifted. At the start, some Gulf leaders may have believed American military pressure could break Iran quickly. Perhaps they believed Israel's arguments. Perhaps they believed Trump's confidence. Perhaps they believed the usual fantasy that a few days of bombs can solve what decades of politics could not. Now they have seen the result. The Strait of Hormuz is closed or severely disrupted. Oil exports are damaged. Gas exports are affected. Shipping is uncertain. Insurance costs rise. Markets panic, then calm down, then panic again, because markets have the emotional stability of a caffeinated pigeon. And the war has not produced surrender. That is the key point. The United States can hurt Iran. Nobody serious doubts that. America is still a military superpower. But hurting a country and forcing it to capitulate are not the same thing. Iran knows this. Iran has endured sanctions for years. It has built smuggling networks, alternative trade routes, domestic production capacity, and relationships with Russia and China. None of that makes Iran invincible. It does make Iran harder to break than many people in Washington seem to assume. The mainstream narrative says this is a stalemate. Militarily, perhaps it is. The United States cannot easily force Iran to give up. Iran cannot defeat the United States directly. But I don't think stalemate captures the situation. Because this is not only a military confrontation, it is an economic siege. And sieges are decided by time. The deeper story is the clock. Washington appears to believe Iran will run out of options first. Tehran appears to believe Washington will run out of patience, oil reserves, and political room first. My read is that Iran may be closer to the truth. Iran can probably withstand the pressure, at least until the end of the year, perhaps longer. That does not mean life inside Iran will be easy. It won't. Sanctions, oil disruption, and war pressure create real hardship for ordinary people. But states can survive hardship if the political system holds. The security apparatus remains loyal, and outside partners keep enough money and goods moving. Iran has China. It has Russia. It has experience. It also has something many Western analysts underestimate: the ability to turn external pressure into domestic legitimacy. Every American threat helps Tehran say, "We told you." This was never about nuclear enrichment. This was about destroying Iran. That message may not convince everyone. It does not need to. It only needs to convince enough people, especially inside the political and security establishment. Meanwhile, the United States has a different problem. It cannot escape the energy consequences forever. The world still needs oil and gas. The Persian Gulf still matters. The Strait of Hormuz is not some decorative line on a map. It is the narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, and before this crisis, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil moved through it. Think of it as a toll booth with missiles nearby. Not ideal. If Hormuz remains disrupted, energy prices rise. If energy prices rise long enough, inflation rises. If inflation rises, households suffer, businesses slow down, central banks panic, and politicians start pretending they always had a plan. There is also a point about American oil that deserves attention. Many people assume the United States is energy independent. In a simple way, it produces huge amounts of oil, yes. But much of what it produces is light crude, while many American refineries are designed for heavier crude. So the United States exports some oil and imports other oil. The system is more complex than the slogan. If American inventories are being drawn down to calm global markets, that can work for a while. But only for a while. Reserves are not a magic barrel in the basement. When they fall too far, the market notices. And when markets notice scarcity, after being artificially calmed, prices can move violently. The warning being discussed is that June may become a serious pressure point, and by September, the situation could become far more difficult to control. I would treat exact dates carefully because energy forecasts are not holy scripture. They are often written in pencil by people who later deny owning pencils. But the direction of travel is clear. No war, no peace, Hormuz disrupted, negotiations fake or frozen, oil markets nervous. That is not a stable equilibrium. That is a slow leak in a room full of electrical equipment. And this is why Iran's strategy is so simple. Sit tight. Reject terms that look like surrender. Let Trump threaten. Let oil markets tighten. Let Gulf states panic. Let China and Russia counsel patience. Then wait for Washington to come back with something closer to reality. That is not heroic. It is cold. It is calculated. And it may work. The third layer is the most worrying one. Even if Washington eventually decides it wants a negotiated settlement, can it actually negotiate one? I know that sounds harsh. But look at the pattern. The United States walked out of the original nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, during Trump's first term. That decision shattered trust. Then Biden came in promising to return to the deal, but never restored it in a consistent, decisive way. Then Trump returned, and instead of coherent diplomacy, We got military strikes, maximal demands, and messages moving through intermediaries. That is not a negotiation process. That is a mood swing with stationary. The comparison with Ukraine is useful here. Since Trump returned to office in January 2025, American diplomacy over Ukraine has looked confused. Multiple proposals, unclear terms, businessmen acting as envoys. Summits floated and canceled. Russians unsure which American plan is even current. Security guarantees discussed with Ukraine, but not clearly explained to Moscow. That is not how serious states negotiate. Serious negotiation requires authority. The other side must know who speaks for the government. It requires consistency. The terms cannot change every 3 days because someone on television shouted loudly enough. It requires patience. It requires technical knowledge. It requires understanding what the other side can accept without committing political suicide. Washington used to know how to do this. It negotiated with North Vietnam in Paris. It negotiated arms control with the Soviet Union. It opened relations with China. None of these talks happened because everyone suddenly became nice. They happened because powerful countries understood that negotiation is not weakness. It is a tool of power. Now Washington often treats diplomacy as a press conference between threats. And Iran knows this too. That is why any future deal will need more than American signatures. Iran will likely want security guarantees, sanctions relief, and some role for Russia or China as guarantors or custodians of sensitive material. If Iran agrees to a moratorium, 5 years is plausible, 20 years is not. If the enriched uranium stockpile becomes part of a deal, handing it to the United States is fantasy. Placing it under Russian custody, diluting it, or putting it under some monitored arrangement might be possible. A deal can be imagined. But imagination is not policy. China and Russia probably want this crisis resolved. Yes, Russia benefits from higher oil prices in the short term. Oil exporters often enjoy the first phase of a price spike. But over time, high energy prices damage global growth, raise inflation, and create instability that eventually harms producers too. China certainly does not want an endless energy shock. It imports huge amounts of energy. It wants stable trade routes. It wants Washington weakened, perhaps, but not global supply chains on fire. So Beijing and Moscow may advise Tehran not to overplay its hand. They may say, take a reasonable deal if one appears. Accept a limited enrichment pause. Secure sanctions relief. Keep your political independence. Don't humiliate Washington so badly that escalation becomes politically tempting. That would be sensible advice. The problem is whether Washington can produce a reasonable offer before the energy clock becomes dangerous. What should we watch? First, Gulf airspace and base access. If Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait remain closed to further escalation, American military options narrow. Second, oil inventories. If drawdowns accelerate, the market may start pricing in panic before officials admit there is panic. Third, the language around enrichment. If Washington moves toward a 5-year moratorium, that signals realism. If it keeps demanding 20 years, it signals theater. Fourth, the stockpile question. If the demand remains, hand it to America, there is no deal. If Russia, China, or international monitoring enters the conversation seriously, diplomacy may have a pulse. Fifth, China. Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping matters because Beijing will see the weakness in Washington's position. China does not need to shout. It can simply sit there, politely, while the Americans explain why their brilliant plan has trapped their own allies. That is always awkward. My honest read is this. Iran has called America's bluff because it understands the difference between military power and strategic endurance. The United States can strike Iran. It can damage Iran. It can threaten Iran. But every escalation risks turning the Gulf against Washington's strategy, pushing oil prices higher, and giving Tehran more reason to dig in. Iran does not need to win in the Hollywood sense. It does not need aircraft carriers or victory parades. It only needs to remain standing long enough for the cost of pressure to become unacceptable to everyone else. That is the part Washington seems to keep missing. The Gulf states want the crisis ended. China wants energy stability. Russia wants prices high, but not chaos without limit. Iran wants sovereignty, sanctions relief, and survival. Even the United States needs an exit. The question is whether Washington still knows how to build one. Because threats are easy. Bombing is easy, at least for the country dropping the bombs. Negotiation is harder. It requires admitting that the other side has interests, red lines, and a vote in the outcome. That used to be called realism. Now it is apparently treated as a personality defect. So Iran waits. The Gulf gets nervous. Oil markets count barrels. Washington threatens, pauses, threatens again, and calls that strategy. But the clock underneath this crisis is not political. It is physical. Ships move or they don't. Refineries receive crude or they don't. Inventories fall or they don't. And if serious negotiations do not begin soon, the market may do what diplomats refuse to do: force a decision. If you found this useful, like and subscribe. There's more to come on this. Stay sharp.